Hello, everybody. I was pretty amazed at how many tracks there are in this conference. Reminds me of OSCON a little bit. But cool, so thanks everybody for showing up. Today I'm going to be talking about Ember. Ember is now, I think we announced it in 2011, so it's been around for a number of years. So what I'm not going to do today is give you a Hello World Ember tutorial. There's plenty of those online. There's even one on the website. And I'm going to do a little bit of something with the terminal and code, but it's not going to be to show you how to use Ember. I want to talk about sort of the Ember philosophy and also how we've been thinking about the entire ecosystem and what we've been learning from other folks in the ecosystem. So I want to start by saying, okay, you've probably heard about Ember before. Let me say how I sort of think about what is Ember. So first of all, Ember is a full stack framework. I don't mean full stack in the sense that Meteor means it. I don't mean that there's a server component. What I mean is that it handles a lot of the layers of abstraction that you expect from something that handles the whole front end. And so that includes today things like debugging tools. It includes CLI tool, building stuff to build. There's an add-on ecosystem, right? So it's not just a little library that you use. It's a full ecosystem of stuff. And that's something that starts to happen after a few years go by. It's not something that necessarily is there when you first start. And when I say Ember is a full stack framework, I think it's important to note that that is very much an aspirational statement. So when Ember started in 2011, we had just forked off of Sprout Core. And we basically started with a HTML, CSS-friendly thing where Sprout Core was very widgety and tried to maintain some of the ideas. And back then, we also said that Ember wants to be a full stack framework. But of course, if you say that, one way to do it is to basically try to ship the whole stack all at once. So you could be like, okay, here's our CLI tool, and here's our server component, and here's here's all this stuff. But I think one thing that should be very clear is that if you try to do that, if you try to boil the ocean, if you say, okay, we want to be a full stack framework, and you try to do everything at once, you're very unlikely to succeed. And there are people in the space that have tried to do much, much bigger things all at once, sort of big bang, whole ecosystem stuff. And we really, I think, knew from the beginning that we were going to focus on what the most important pain points were and then sort of grow out a little bit at a time. And the most important thing about that is not just in terms of tactics, that we were able to ship something incrementally. It's that if you ship something incrementally, you can learn a lot from the ecosystem of developers about what exactly is required, right? So if you start from the beginning and you come up with this brilliant idea that's going to take you 5 years to ship, if you try to ship a 5-year plan, what will end up happening is that as you start to learn more and more about what's going on, you may feel frustrated by the 5-year plan, but it's very difficult to reorient the ship. So for us, starting with a very first release was basically just a templating engine, sort of how a lot of people start. And we've just been growing and growing, rolling more stuff into the core of the framework as things have stabilized, as the ecosystem have learned, as we kind of understood the problem. And one of the things that I think is really powerful about how the Ember ecosystem works, this is the Firefox release timeline. And there's a sort of problem that exists when you try to build somewhat stable, somewhat non-trivial things, which is that there's a big tension between wanting to ship relatively often and new stuff and not stagnate, while at the same time having your users feel somewhat confident that things are not breaking all the time. So I think one thing that sort of happens when you start releasing a lot of releases, if you're not careful, is people start getting afraid of the upgrades because they say, oh, every time I have to release, I have to spend like a week upgrading. That's very annoying. And I think the browsers had this problem in spades because on the web, once you ship something, you basically can't ever remove it. So on the web, there was this like very serious problem that Firefox and Chrome and now more browsers really want to be making progress, but at the same time, they know that once they ship, it's basically game over. And so what the browsers invented, Chrome first and then followed on by other browsers, is what Firefox calls rapid release and Chrome calls the 6-week release cycle. And the basic idea is you always add new features behind a feature flag. And every 6 weeks, you ship a new set of features, which is just all the features that you ever added that became stable. So you let people work with the features on sort of an unstable branch in Chrome that's called Canary. In Firefox, that's called Aurora. You let people work with it in an unstable place, and that's sort of a signaling, like this is unstable. If you use it, it's dangerous. And then you sort of incrementally move it towards the stable release as it becomes more and more stable and as you feel more and more confident that you won't have to break it. And that was a thing that browsers have done, and I think you can see that that was very successful in browsers. And it's something that Ember sort of picked up after 1.0. So once we released 1.0, we knew that we cared a lot about Semver. This was a high priority thing for us. But we also knew that Semver often can cause stagnation. And so we looked around at the ecosystem and we said, we think browsers have really nailed this. And so Ember sort of adopted the same strategy that browsers have, which is that we start off with new features on Canary. Canary is a build you can download just fine and use it, but it's unstable. And then as things become more stable, they end up on beta and eventually the release channel. And if you go to the Ember website, you can see that we have a regular accounting for what's going on. So you can see the last release was 1.7, and the next release is 1.8. It's coming out tomorrow, actually. And there's a beta release that comes out throughout the process, just like in browsers. So I think that that has actually been really awesome. Ember sort of experimented with this new model that Chrome had experimented with, but we're now up to version 1.8, and it's been really effective for us to be able to, like I said, continue to iterate on new features, change what we're doing without stagnation. And that's really a tactic, an implementation strategy of something that if you watch a talk that I gave a year or 2 years or 3 years ago, you would have heard me say is sort of a core tenet of Ember, which is the idea that as the ecosystem learns more stuff, we roll in the best practices of the ecosystem into Ember. And that doesn't mean that we roll in a practice as soon as somebody starts using it somewhere, as soon as it first appears on Hacker News, right? I think Ember developers tend to experiment just like anybody else, but before it makes it into Ember, we take some time to make sure that it's actually a good idea, but we're pretty cutting edge about what we start to pull in. And this is sort of in contrast to I think how a lot of JavaScript people work, and something that I personally found very frustrating and frankly exhausting, which is basically chasing the hype dragon, chasing the idea that every single time something new comes out and it's experimental, you should play with it and just hop from one thing to the next thing to the next thing, and always in search of the next high, and never really getting to a stable place. And I think for Ember, we definitely want to be cutting edge. We want to be able to pull in new ideas, but we don't want to be feeling like you can never get something stable under your feet, right? When you're building an app, you really want some kind of stability. And so I said a lot of stuff just now about our ideals. I kind of want to talk about what we've done over the past few years. And I think in particular, if you saw me give a talk ever, pretty much I always talk about things that are coming next. So if you see me give a talk, you might get the idea that everything in Ember is always vaporware. But actually, when I went to give this talk, what I realized is that we've actually delivered on quite a few promises, some of which are not super trivial. So the first one is, I'm basically giving this story in tweets. The first one you can see in 2012, someone said, I got outvoted, I wanted to switch to Angular. Biggest gripe was out-of-date docs. And then you can see several months later, someone says, great new Ember docs. And then a little bit later, so Ember guides are pretty awesome, right? So we knew that things sucked, and I think we talked a lot about fixing docs, but that wasn't just something that we said out loud. It was something that we poured a lot of energy into and really fixed. Another thing, if you saw me give a talk a few years ago, is Ember Data has historically been somewhat of a pain point for Ember, and so we used to get a lot of tweets like this. After all the time I've invested in Ember, it really sucks that Ember Data is so broken. And then a few months later, Ember Data story is a little bit more stretched out. Minutes after tweeting about how much more I'm liking Ember Data, I find out there's new guides too, right? So basically, this was another area that I think we've improved. And in 2013, things were still not as great as they could be, but I think now things are pretty solid. Another thing is we started off, I think we knew from the beginning that we would want to have CLI tools. But we knew that trying to ship Ember as a library and also shipping CLI tools at the same time was going to be too much of a boil the ocean problem, the Dilbert problem. And so what we did was we had core team members build a thing called Ember App Kit on the outside. And Ember App Kit was so unpolished that this was the logo that they made for it. But it was a good opportunity for us to take something that we knew was unstable and we knew was cutting edge and get a lot of information about what it is that makes a modern cutting edge build tools. And so today we sort of moved from there to Ember CLI, which is more of a tool that we promote now, and it's something that I'll show in a little bit. But it's something that I think we're a little proud of. We don't have a logo for it yet, but it's not going to be the one on the left. Another example, at my keynote at Ember Camp, which was the first EmberConf in 2012, I had one more thing, which is the Ember Inspector. And I can tell you, I think I did a good job of hiding the lack of polish, but it was held together by baling wire and duct tape. But I showed it, and it was cool, and I think we like it. And if you look, but it wasn't released yet. And I think if you look forward, a year from there, you can see, gosh, this Ember Inspector is so awesome, makes me want to switch to Chrome as my default browser. But no, we would not want that. You can see in a few months after that, you should see how we ported the Ember Inspector to Firefox. And then you can see a few months after that, watching Tom Dale's building an Ember.js application, and the Chrome Inspector is kind of blowing my mind. And this is, again, something that we announced, we talked about, that you might have, if you looked, I think a lot of people sort of come into talks like this, you sort of see a snapshot in time, and maybe at a certain snapshot in time, there was Ember App Kit, and there was Ember Data was broken, and Ember Inspector was still experimental. But you can see that we have a history of delivering. Testing, so you can see in early 2013, I've really struggled with acceptance testing. Here's hoping you were able to figure out more than I was. And then more recently, this is yesterday, I guess, Ember Cli is drastically undersold, especially regarding its name. And then we have all this stuff, including testing, which I think Ember Cli really nails and gets really well. So that's all a bunch of stuff that we've done. Another thing that I'm pretty proud of is making the Ember structure go from globals, which is when we shipped, to supporting modules. And that's something we did without breaking support for globals. So if you wrote an Ember 1.0 app that uses globals, you can still write an Ember 1.8 app that uses globals today. So we have to do this forking. We have to write an abstraction layer between these things. We have to do all this stuff for stability. But we were able to get modules support baked into the framework sort of as the train was going, which I think is pretty great. Another thing, if you looked at Ember before, you might have noticed that the DOM used to be full of all these, or still is until tomorrow. But we announced a few months ago that we had a plan for killing it. That's the only valid use case for flame animation. We announced a few months ago that we had a plan for killing it, and in Ember 1.8, which comes out tomorrow, so that means that it made it through Canary and made it through beta, and it's now landing metal views, successfully eliminates the script tags, which I think is great. So what does all of that sort of mean? What it sort of means is that Ember is very aspirational, and I think it's easy to look at Ember in a snapshot in time and compare it to a lot of other frameworks and say, oh, well, Ember has a little bad testing story, or Ember has a not so good inspector, or Ember's data story needs some work, and then forget to follow up. And I think Ember has been very, very aggressive and very successful at taking things that were not so good in the beginning and continuing to iterate on them. And I think we've done that far, far more effectively than frameworks that are not necessarily thinking of themselves as full stack or big picture. And again, like I said, because of the fact that we do this release cycle, the train release cycle that Chrome pioneered, what has happened is that people effectively are able to build applications on top of Ember. So here's just a few examples and what version. I went into the Ember Inspector and got the version that they were up to. And you can see Square is the most behind. There are 3 releases behind, which means 3 6-week release cycles. I guess 2 6-week release cycles. But pretty much everyone stays very close to Edge. And these are applications that are production applications that have, obviously, shipping requirements. And they're staying pretty up to date. And that's because, in general, updating from one version of Ember to the next is a very quick affair because of Semver. So what I want to show you is sort of, again, just gave you a bunch of stuff. I kind of want to show you what the modern Ember toolchain looks like. So let me do that. So here you can see, because of the fact that conference Wi-Fi, I actually have tethered, but even my tethered Wi-Fi is no match for NPM. You can see that I basically ran Ember new before I started, and so now we have a new Ember app. So first of all, there's a generator, kind of like other full-stack frameworks, that will generate a bunch of stuff for you. And so if I go now into Oh My God and run Ember server, you can see that it will build a bunch of stuff for me. If I go to localhost 4200, hopefully it will do things. Come on. I basically never survived the demo troll, ever. OK, there we go. So it loaded. And let me quickly open up MacVim just to show you sort of what it looks like. So basically, if you look at an Ember app, so one nice thing about Ember is that you tend to have a lot in common. Every Ember app has a lot in common with each other. And that's even more true with the modern build tools that come with Ember now. So For example, here's a bunch of templates, right? So you can see here's the application template as I would expect, and here it says welcome to Ember.js, which is great. And a couple things that are interesting that are happening here. So you can see that it's generating a bunch of JavaScript for you. It's basically making a package just like you would expect. Like you don't have to set up Grunt or Gulp or anything like that. It's basically built in. But there's also a bunch of nice things that are baked in. So for example, if I want to run my tests, I can go to /tests, and it will run them. There's some stubs that come there. I can go into tests. I can go into here. Actually, I have no idea where those tests are coming from.
Make that bigger.
Yeah, absolutely. They're not in unit. But I can generate a test. So if I say Ember G, Ember help G, you get a list of all the stuff, and I can say Ember G, I suspect unit test, hello. I'll just say helper test. Okay. Why am I getting so trolled today? So here's my test. You can see I've created one that says it works. If I run the server, it fails. So angry. I have no idea what's happening here. That is probably true. Yeah. OK, I'm going to move on. But so there are, let me hope it doesn't crash now. OK, I suspect everything will be back. OK, great. So I showed that you can run tests. Hopefully that will work. Hello? Come on. OK, I give up. I'm crying. So I actually have another. I have what I set up before, which I will. This sucks. So there's something messed up with tests, it looks like. Anyway, what I wanted to show is that if you run Ember tests, or test, it builds and it will run the tests in Phantom.js, which is good, although, again, there seems to be something busted. I suspect there's like a hung file somewhere chilling out, which is pretty, yeah, something like that. OK, so let me go back to Ember Server. So I want to show a couple things before I go back to my talk. This was not very successful. I'm sorry about that. So one of them is just the add-on ecosystem. So I want to add an add-on. The first thing I want to do is I want to add an add-on that lets me copy the thing that GitHub has to let you copy some random text, right? So I think it's called like Zero Clipboard. So I can go to emberaddons.com. I can go to Zero Clipboard. I can have Wi-Fi that works. I actually have it open here. So I can run this, npm install, save devs, Ember CLI, Zero Clipboard. And basically, this is just, I don't know if you've used this, but this is like what GitHub uses to let you click on something and get some data. Npm finish. I'll just continue while it's installing. So if I go into application HPS, if you go to the docs, it tells you that you can do this. So I'll grab one of these. I'll paste it in here, and I'll say the text is like hello, and the label is copy hello. And I can continue to wait. This is not a very cool demo, I'm sorry. I even have this file on my computer. npm is so slow. OK, I'm gonna go back to my talk. Sorry for the somewhat demo fail. But I'll maybe come back to it later to see if it has finished installing. But basically, the core idea here, and most people who write Ember apps these days use Ember CLI, and as a person who uses it every day, that's not the normal, that's not the normal situation. You basically get a whole stack of tools. I have to switch back, sorry. You basically get a whole stack of tools. You get testing, you get building, you get minification, you get transpilation from ES6 modules, other ES6 transpilation, you get an add-on ecosystem, you get testing through Phantom.js, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Like if you're used to Rails, you might be aware of like the hex digest that runs to let you bust the cache. There's support for that, right? So there's a lot of fine-grained little details that work really nicely in Ember CLI, and that's stuff that makes everything feel good. That makes it feel like you can be productive when you're not giving a demo on conference Wi-Fi. Okay, so I think the core point here is just, in general, Ember is, we don't really stand still. We don't say, okay, we had this idea, and now we have a bunch of stuff that has happened, and we're gonna stop, or we're gonna stop the world and take a year to rebuild everything. We're basically always looking for stuff that has happened in the ecosystem that has stabilized, or stuff that we've learned, or things that Ember users have figured out is the right way to do stuff, and figuring out ways to pull things in. So on that front, I kind of want to confess a little bit of Ember sins. And this is sort of just talking about where Ember was a few years ago and what we've learned from a lot of other frameworks. So when Ember first came out in the beginning, Ember was competing largely with Backbone.js. Backbone.js right now, I think, has sort of stagnated a little bit, but I think that's largely because it's 800 lines of code. But I think when we started, we were still in a world where a lot of the frameworks that existed, like Dojo and Sprout Core and Cappuccino, were really big. And it took some energy for us to refocus on the world where you should try to not be huge. And so very, very early on, what Backbone helped us realize is that we needed to go from Sprout Core, which was really big, and really pare down into the bare minimum and build something that was plausibly sized. And so that was something that, if you saw me talking a few years ago, that's what we learned from Backbone. Angular actually taught us two really important things. The first really important thing is that when we first started with Ember, we had a view story that was sort of low level and very inherited from Sprout Core, which is inherited from Cocoa. And a lot of the aspects of that view story were very difficult to wrap your mind around. And I think one of the things that we saw people really liked about Angular right away from the beginning was the fact that you could easily write and encapsulate a directive very simply. And that doesn't necessarily mean that directives are the easiest thing to write, or that Ember views were the most impossible thing to write. But the reality was that at the time, directives were a dramatic simplification from what we had. And we sort of did a leapfrogging step we tried to do by making an Ember component story that was also very simple and encapsulated and isolated. So that was one thing that we learned. The second thing that we learned is that dependency injection is a useful feature. And what I mean by that is not to say that every single user of Ember should be thinking about dependency injection all the time. That's sort of how Angular rolls. And I think when we first saw it, we sort of thought, well, we don't want everybody to think about dependency injection all the time. But what Angular showed us was that they had a good testing story from the beginning, largely because of this. And what Angular showed us was that factoring the internals and the way the application works in terms of dependency injection is a very useful way of ensuring certain kinds of isolation that have a lot of ancillary benefits. So basically, a few years ago, I think our component story was in shambles, and we had a lot of globals everywhere. And today, we have a very isolated, good component story, and a much better, we have a container dependency injection stuff under the hood. And I think that's pretty important, and that's something that I think we did very poorly early on. And more recently, we've been looking at React. So some of you probably were in the React talk before. And we sort of look at it. I think there's a certain amount of hype fatigue for sure, where like every few months is a new thing. And even for us, who sort of spend a lot of time thinking about this stuff, when React first came out, we were like, oh, really, another framework that we have to investigate? But people really, I think there's something to be learned from all these frameworks. And in particular, there were two pretty big things that I think we learned from React that were now in the process of incorporating. And the reason that I told the story before about promises that we've delivered on is to say that this is not something that I'm saying and maybe we'll never get to. This is something we're actively thinking about. First of all, I think the idea that in React there's a clear story for how you should manage your data flow is very useful. So as the previous speaker said, in React, you're supposed to do things in a unidirectional data flow model. And I think that's something that a lot of people have sort of come to on their own in Ember already, but definitely it's not part of our core zeitgeist, and there's a few things that we need to do to make it easier and better. And then sort of coupled to that is React has basically done the R&D of showing that you can re-render big chunks of the screen and then figure out retroactively what things need to be updated and make that relatively fast. I think it was not obvious to us before React did it that it could be done performantly. But React shows that that's something you can do performantly, which means that the programming model of like something has changed, re-render this whole area, which is sort of part of the unidirectional data flow model, is something that you can do. And so those are two areas where I think Ember right now maybe is overly coupled to fine-grained data observation. And we think that there's some areas where that's very useful, for example, when you have a full app. But it's something that I think we're going to be paring down for components. So that's all stuff we learned about from other frameworks. For me, the core idea of Ember that has been there from the beginning and is still there today is the idea of consistency. And when I say consistency, what I mean is the kind of consistency that you could only get by handing over parts of your application to a full stack framework. So let me give you an example. So imagine that you have a page called apps1. And the way you start off, you built your app for the first time, the way you render apps1 is that you navigate to it, of course, and you put some stuff on the screen. And then later on, you have apps2, and you have a link in there, and it lets you go to apps1. And then later on, maybe you want to let people go to apps1 from their settings page, which is yet another route. And then there may be more stuff in the future. Something that is very important to Ember, and it's something that, again, really is, it falls out of the fact that Ember is full stack, and you hand a lot of routing control to us, is the actual code that gets written that says, OK, apps1, now I know that it's this model, it's this app, it's whatever app. I would like to render it. All the code that happens from that point on, from when you have an app and you want to put it on the screen, all that code is consistent regardless of which arrow this is taking. And that's something that's not just like idiomatic. It's something that Ember really enforces, that no matter how you enter a particular route, the vast majority of the code is identical. And that means that you can really experiment. So the question mark basically to me is like, you don't really know when you start building your app. You're still in exploration mode. You don't know all the places where things are going to link. And especially on the web, when you have all these links, like you don't really know what's going to go to what. So it's really important that going to a route and how it gets put on the screen is very consistent. It's something that you don't necessarily have to think about all the time. And here's another example of sort of a similar thing. So here, this is Skylight. This is the app I work on. And you can see on the top is my name, Yehuda Katz, all the way on top over there. And what I'm going to do is just virtually open up the Ember Inspector, which I'll show you in a minute again. And in the Ember Inspector, you can see that I've clicked on all the users. And in all the users, I've clicked on a particular user. And you can see if I click on the name, I get Yehuda Katz pops out. And if I type in Tom Dale over there and hit Enter, you can see that the name changes to Tom Dale, right? That is the thing that happens. So let me go back for a second. And the reason why that happens is because the way that that's put on the screen, the way that Yehuda Katz is put on the screen, is not because I navigated to a specific page or because a certain WebSocket request came back or because I made a certain XHR. It's not in response to a particular thing happening. It's there is a user, which is basically an application-wide concept called a user. His name is Yehuda Katz. However that happens to change, no matter what vector, and like I said, there's a whole bunch of them. Here's just some examples. No matter how that changes, it will always update. And that happens without you having to remember, let me go modify this DOM, or let me re-render this. If you get back a thing from the WebSocket and you just update that sort of application-wide object, it will update itself automatically. And basically, at its core, Ember's core philosophy is that for most things that you're doing, there should be one representation of the thing that's on the screen, or the place that you're going, the page that you're going to, and there should be one code path that represents it. And that way, if you add more things, if you want to explore with other options, if you want to add more pages, more things on the screen, if you want to move something from one place to another, you tend to be able to do that aggressively. You tend to be able to tinker a lot play around a lot without fearing that something is going to break. There is some data flow. There's some order that really mattered. You know, a lot of times people have applications, and it really matters that you go to the index page first because that's where all the setup happens. And if you happen to reload some other page, everything starts breaking, right? And so for Ember, our core philosophy is there's one representation of things. There's one data flow. Once you've written it one time, however else it gets updated correctly. And so there's the idea that you have the freedom to explore, try different UIs, and not have to fear that bad things will happen. So what is the future for Ember? Is it old man Ember? Hopefully not, maybe someday. So one of the things that I'm super excited about is a thing called HTML bars. And if you've followed Ember, you probably know that this is like kind of an umbrella term for a lot of stuff that means like make the view layer better. But I'm specifically talking about two things. The first thing that I'm talking about is making this possible. So fixing the fact that the current templating engine is based on strings. So the curlies don't really know exactly where they are located. So there's a lot of hacks that you have to do. Not a lot of hacks. There's a small number of hacks that you end up having to do often. And this is something that HTML bars will allow, and I think it'll come in like one of the next 2 releases, allegedly. And a consequence of HTML bars is that it will make the view layer faster, both in terms of just general performance. I think we have like a 2x performance boost just from switching the templating engine, but also it incorporates and it will increasingly incorporate a lot of the React ideas around virtual DOM and diffing and only updating what has to be updated to make it so that if you have an array and you say this whole array updated today in Ember, that's a very slow operation. So this is kind of like a macro improvement that instead of having to re-render areas for real, we will adopt a lot of the React ideas around around re-rendering things only when they really need to be re-rendered. And this is something that is probably will not be there in full in the very first release after HTML bars lands, but HTML bars is sort of a prerequisite to doing a lot of that work that we have plans for. So that's pretty exciting. I think having the opportunity to make it so that you can think about big chunky updates instead of necessarily like little granular updates is a pretty big win. So I think as a whole, the next Ember in the next few months and year hopefully will get simpler and clearer. The first thing is, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this. Trek is going to kill me. I'm pretty sure that we're going to replace the concept of a controller with the concept of a top-level component. And if you've written a lot of Ember, what you probably have noticed is that it's already very similar to a top-level component. It's already very similar to a component, but there's kind of an arbitrary division of responsibility between the controller and the component. And this is sort of a thing that we picked up from Coco. So I think a thing that we're going to try to do, again, with a very good migration path, without trying not to break things, is to say that if you want to have a route go to a component instead of a controller, that will work. I think that's good. I'm very excited about that. This is something that you'll have to see when we announce some more of the details, but basically we plan to simplify data flow between components, and as part of that, bring in the virtual DOM idea so that instead of, I think there's areas right now where data flow is a little bit too implicit, and we'll be increasingly making it implicit, making actions be more direct and clear. So that's something that is happening also. And then I think the thing that makes me most excited is there's a lot of stuff that has happened that I talked about that isn't really on the website yet because it's all in various states of undress. And so we have, for example, the fact that Ember today, pretty much any new Ember app is people use modules, not globals. But if you look at the website still tells you to use globals. Ember Data is pretty far along, but some more important stuff like how you make an adapter is still very under-documented. Ember Cli right now is a totally separate website. It's historically been an experimental project, but we're getting to a point where it's less experimental and more baked in. So really people who use Ember should be using Ember Cli from the get-go. And then similarly, the Ember Inspector, like basically, I think it's even to the point where if you try to use Ember without the Ember Inspector, you get a warning like, hey, why you know Ember Inspector? But it's not really anywhere on the website. We don't tell you about it. So I think for me, there's obviously some stuff that I want to see improved, but the biggest issue for me right now is making the website reflect like what it is like to be an Ember developer and not what it was like to be an Ember developer a year ago. Now, the good news is that because things are compatible, because of Semver, what it was like to be an Ember developer a year ago still works. But it's a small subset of what it's like to be an Ember developer for real. So that's something that I'm quite happy to see improved. And I think just in general, my message here is, I think it's very easy to look at Hacker News and say, oh, a new thing came out, and to stop everything, drop everything, and play around with a new thing. And I feel like you get a high when you first play with something and you try, you make a single screen and it's very simple and it's nice and it's a breath of fresh air. That's pretty much always the case with every new thing. It happens to me and I build Ember. But it's also a very exhausting process where every single time you feel like you're always forced to constantly be looking at new stuff. And I think what I want to say about Ember is that we really care a lot about taking things that are exciting and new, whether it's ideas that are in React or Angular, or ideas that our community comes up with, and making them part of Ember in the future. So you don't have to chase the hype dragon to get a little bit of new stuff. You can wait a little bit longer for it to become stable, but eventually all the good ideas will end up in Ember. And I think that's something that we care a lot about, and it's something that hopefully I have persuaded you of. Now, before I go, I have a couple minutes. Let me see if Npm finished installing ever. Aha! It has finished installing. OK. Let's do this. OK, so I installed Zero Clipboard. I feel like I'm just asking for sadness, for sure. OK, let's run Ember server. OK, so you can see it says copy hello. So it did all this stuff. If you ever use Zero Clipboard, you know there's steps that I did not have to do. If I click copy hello, it says hello. But actually, the cool thing here is, of course, this is not just a random component. It's a component that supports data binding like any other component. So if I was to go in, let me generate a new router. Oh my god, there's something like pretty busted on the file system, it seems like. Anyway, if I say Ember.js resource, and let's say I say like users, and I make a new user. Very sad. If I make a new user, let me just reboot the server. And if I go into the route, which is the users, the first thing I'll do, so let me just show you, if you go into the router, there is a thing called users. And actually, let me make it users slash resource users path users user ID. And I'll go implement the model hook here. Params. I'll just alert params.userid just to confirm that it works. If I go to users ycats, okay, you can see that it went there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to grab my user from GitHub, and I'm just going to make it copyable. So I'm going to return ember.$.getJSON. So this is just making an AJAX request, https api.github.com/users/ and then I'll just add params.userid. And I'll just go into the template that the generator helpfully created for me. And I'll say h1. I think it's login. I probably made a mistake somewhere. It's sad. All right, I'm going to not try to make this work live, but I do want to show you one thing, which is, I'll just go to like Skylight. I just want to do quickly show you the Ember Inspector, because I think it's pretty cool, and I was going to show it as part of my demo, which didn't work that well, so I'll show it to you as as a standalone thing. Or I can just go to like Bustle. If any internet, oh my god. Really? I'm going to make this work. I have 5 minutes. I feel like I need to get like a dedicated, this is like my phone. Really? There's probably a Yosemite bug, for sure. I feel like Apple never can get Wi-Fi right. Like basically every release has some like critical Wi-Fi bug that there's many, many threads on the. Okay, I'm gonna try switching to conference Wi-Fi. Come on. Nope. Well. This guy? Open World 2014. Boom. Okay. Oh my God, there's Wi-Fi. Seems crazy. Okay, so here's Bustle. Yeah. I've successfully demoed the Wi-Fi working. So here's the Ember Inspector. This is 1.6, which is the latest one. I usually, like when I'm on an Ember app, just go look at the info, see like what libraries. You can see that they are using a third-party library that's hooked into the inspector, so it can tell you what version it's using. So the cool thing about the inspector is it basically, Ember kind of has like a programming model that's higher level. It's like more abstract than just like DOM. And the inspector shows you what's going on in terms of that. So if I start clicking around, you can see, you can see, for example, that it's like, okay, I was on application home. Now I'm on application article page. And if I hover over it, I can get a thing that tells me what's going on. Right, here's the model, whatever. If I click on the model, it will bring up the properties. I can click on this. You can see it's like family on Ebola, quarantine, or whatever. I can like add exclamation points. It will work, which is great. You can see a bunch of stuff. But there's actually a lot of really useful stuff. So that, I think, is probably where people spend most of their time in the inspector. The routes is pretty cool because one thing that you probably learn if you're using Ember is like Ember cares a lot about conventions. So if you're starting to use Ember and you're like, I have this route, I don't really know what to name the controller, although that kind of problem is less and less important with the CLI tool that generates stuff for you. You can go here and you can say, okay, I have this error route or this loading route or this news route, and it will tell you exactly what to call it. And you can click on any of these things. So I want to look at the controller, right? It will basically show me what's going on. I like data, but I will show it to you. They're not using Ember Data, they're using Restless. So I'll go into Skylight, which is the app I work on, which uses Ember Data. So if you go into here, you can see that there's just like a list of all the models that exist. And if I go into like, I showed this in my slides. If you go to user, here's Yehuda, right? So I'm represented over here. If I change this to like I showed in the slides, like Tom Dale, it will change. But it's also the case that if I go into like an app, and so here we have an app, and it's called Native Agent Test, and I change it to like Dumb Agent Test or something, you can see it obviously updated my application here, but if I go over here, it will update here as well, right? Because there are some kinds of models that are kind of application-wide. They exist in many places, and being able to update them in one place. So you can sort of think of this as like a WebSocket, right? It's like something is coming in, but it gives you some good debugging tools. If you've ever worked with promises in JavaScript, you know that learning when things are rejected can be very painful. So there's an advanced inspector that will give you things like the stack trace, right? You can print this out, and we'll give you the exact stack trace for where things happened or where the promises were created. This container thing just landed right now, which basically just shows you all the things that are in the dependency injection container. It's definitely an advanced feature, but once you get knowledgeable, it helps you poke around. So I can look at like, let me look at this helper. It's like, that's not a good example. But here is like the data adapter, and now I can see all the methods and what it inherits from, everything like that. And this was added a long time ago, but it's actually pretty cool. It basically shows you as you navigate around how much time things are taking to render. So if you're like, why was that super slow? You can click on it, and it will basically show you, okay, well, I have a time explorer component. That's taking 4 milliseconds. That seems fine. Okay, so there's an outlet. If I go in there, I can see that the cost seems to be in this thing here, right? And you can basically drill down, okay, well, the select pop-up is taking 10 milliseconds, whatever. So that ends up being pretty nice. That was added by Discourse, who care a lot about performance. And that's something that you can start poking around with if you notice something slow and want to figure out exactly where the slowness is. So that's cool. And actually, if you look at the view tree, if you just want to get like a high-level overview, there's a duration column, which is basically just the most recent time that it took. So if you go here and you say, okay, the most recent time was 45 milliseconds, and then you can basically go into the render performance tab and maybe click around to see, okay, well, if I click on this one, it's a lot bigger. Maybe that will give me some clue as to what's going on. So anyway, I like the Ember Inspector. I like Ember Cli. I like the fact that we're building a full stack, whole thing. And I think you should get involved in Ember, and you should help us build awesome stuff, aspirational stuff, ambitious stuff. Thank you very much.